If you watched House of the Dragon episode 7, episode Driftmark, there's a good chance you may have seen it look like this. So in this video, we're going to talk about what's going on with the episode and how you can brighten it up to make it more visible like this, and how to do so without straying too far from the creator's intent. So while there's different opinions going around about this episode, one thing to keep in mind is HBO did come out and say that this is how it was intended to be, and it was how it was created. So whether you agree with that or not, they are the creator, they're the artist, it's what they wanted. So the first thing I'm going to do is just play it as if I was going to play it normally, which means it's going to start in Dolby Vision. And I'm going to show you how with all the lights on and window open, that in Dolby Vision, not really recommended to watch it that way. So right now I had the camera adjusted for the TV so you could see all the settings, but now I'm going to keep the camera adjusted to the lighting of the room so that the TVs, one being the G2 on the left and the A95K on the right, will be more accurately represented through the camera. So again, you can change the exposure on the camera to change how it looks, but not trying to do that, trying to make it look how it does in this environment. So starting with the Sony in Dolby Vision, the way to most accurately represent the creator's intent would be to use Dolby Vision Dark with tone mapping off and nothing else. What we're going to do, because this is such a bright room, is I'm showing it in Dolby Vision Bright, changing the tone mapping to brightness preferred. Some people even try the contrast enhancer, which going from off, low, medium, high on the Sony in this particular situation is gradually increasing the brightness of most of the image. But in order for advanced contrast enhancer to actually give a perceived difference in contrast, we'll manipulate the gamma, or in this case EOTF curve, into an S shape, and it will vary based on the setting. So as we'll see later, in some cases it can actually darken shadow detail. Now the other thing you can do on the Sony is increase the gamma slider, which is going to greatly raise the EOTF, which is already raised, by using the Dolby Bright picture mode with brightness preferred and so on. Now on the LG, what some might do is use the Cinema Home setting instead of Cinema, and under AI service, enable the AI brightness setting toggle, which you can see does make a faint difference to some of the darker, more shadow detail areas. And then with the recent update on the 2022 models, you did get the precision detail added, which also does similar. You can see the dynamic contrast on the LG. The medium setting was actually the brightest, and in the end, none of this is recommended at all. Right now, the camera is turned down for the menu to be seen, but the curtain's still open, all the lights are still on, so it's this bright in the room. So even with all these changes, while it does get brighter, the Sony gets brighter than the LG in this inaccurate, boosting mode, mostly because it has that adjustable gamma slider while in Dolby Vision. But this is not recommended at all. This is straying way too far from creator's intent and looks nothing like it is intended to look like. However, this is probably what a lot of people are going to try to do. So before we get to what you should do in the bright room setting, first let's see how it looks in a dark room. So now the lights are off, curtains closed, and it's still daytime, so there's still ambient light in the back. And also I'm going to leave the bias lighting on the G2 turned on. But even then, in the accurate Dolby Vision modes for both TVs, it's still much better than it was just by changing the ambient conditions. You need to remember that all of these grades are done in a dark reference environment. So now when I switch the TVs over to that overly brightened mode, you can see just how drastic of a difference it is, and it's completely mood changing. Now with both of these being out of the box, the LG in its Dolby Vision mode is actually a little bit overly lifted compared to the Sony in its Dolby Vision dark mode. So you'll see in the accurate modes that the LG is slightly brighter, but it's not that far off, and considering the amount of light in the room right now, it's not that bad, and maybe LG is doing that now on purpose because of its more intended for home use. So if you're going to stick with using Dolby Vision, what I'm going to do is go through and show some recommended settings of being a little bit brighter without being too crazy. So it would function as a day mode for Dolby Vision. In the Dolby Bright mode on the Sony, turn off the contrast enhancer, keep the gamma at 0, and set the tone mapping to gradation preferred. And then on the LG, you can use Cinema Home. Again, turn off dynamic contrast. And then with Cinema Home is where you can use the new precision detail setting. And then if you go to the AI settings and turn on the AI brightness, then that's how you get Dolby Vision IQ. And then you get Dolby Vision IQ with precision detail if you have both of them enabled. And so doing all of this will give you a mode in Dolby Vision that doesn't stray terribly far, being crazy and accurate, but it does help if you are in a somewhat brighter environment, being able to raise some of the shadow detail to make it a little bit more visible. So I'm trying to adjust the camera a little bit so that you can see the menu of the screen where I'm toggle off and on the AI brightness setting. It's kind of hard to tell from the camera, but in person you'll be able to see that difference. So now that I adjust the camera back to the room, you can see how both of these now look. So the LG does, again, raise it up a little bit more than on the Sony. But on the Sony, I also had it in gradation preferred on Dolby Bright, which does pull down the brightness, making it more accurate. So if you turn that to off while in Dolby Bright, then it's more like what the LG is right now. Again, it's a higher lift of the EOTF, which makes it less accurate, but more visible when you're not in the proper environment to watch the content. With Dolby Dark being the most accurate setting here, and if this room was entirely dark, then it would be perfectly visible in Dolby Vision Dark or the cinema mode over here on the LG. So the best and most accurate way to watch this would be in Dolby Vision Dark on the Sony or Dolby Vision Cinema on the LG with nothing extra turned on and having a completely darkened environment. That's how you see it as it was intended. But most people aren't going to do that or can't do that. So now what happens if you aren't using or don't have Dolby Vision? Well, then let's go to HDR10. So on the LG HDR10, I'm in filmmaker mode, and on the Sony, I am in cinema mode with the contrast enhancer and live color disabled so that it is accurate like the custom mode. Now the number one thing that's going to affect a lot of you is ASBL, this being a long dark scene. So if you have an LG, I suggest going in the service menu and disable that if you're concerned about it and you're not worried about any possible warranty issues. The Sony, you don't have to worry about that on the A95K, but their other OLEDs could potentially be an issue. And then with Samsung, with like the S95B, again, you can go in the service menu and disable that. But again, potential warranty concerns, you decide if you're going to do that. If you don't want to go into the service menu and disable it, you can, if it gets really, really dark, just pull up a menu, switch an input, switch back, do something to trigger it to set back to normal. However, if you're going to watch with the lights on, then the ASBL thing doesn't really matter, as you'll see in a few moments as we get to the best way to watch it with lights on. But first, while we are in HDR, I'm going to toggle on the light sensor. I see this asked a lot. So on the Sony, there's different settings for the light sensor, whereas on the LG, it's basically just the one toggle for the AI brightness as long as you have all the eco stuff turned off. However, I've noticed in SDR on the Sony, it doesn't work well and actually can make it darker. And then on the LG, I'm going to go in and turn on dynamic tone mapping and check the contrast setting again, just like we did with Dolby Vision, showing what a lot of people are going to do to try and brighten the image. These are not things that I recommend you do. I'm just showing what a lot of people are trying to do and basically trying to max out brightness while in Dolby Vision or HDR, and it just doesn't really work out that well. And you can see that the lights are back on and the curtains open again, and the camera is set back again to the room so that the TVs are more relative to each other because the exposure of the camera is set manually to the room. Now on the Sony, you're going to find that the brightest for HDR10 is to actually have the tone mapping set to off. This will limit the peak brightness to about 550 nits, but it will push the EOTF much higher than if it was on gradation or brightness preferred. And in this episode, we don't have to worry about a high peak brightness. And then again, you still have control over that gamma setting, which is just, again, lifting the EOTF even more. And then the contrast enhancer, again, still gives a little bit of a bump too, so that's the Sony as bright as it's going to get. While in HDR10, and again, it's a bit brighter than what we see on the LG with it turned up all the way, mostly because of that gamma slider setting. But just like with the Dolby Vision setup, what we're going to do is set the TVs back to their accurate setup for HDR10, and we're going to do the number one thing that you should be doing to try to watch this, and that's darkening the environment, closing the curtain, turning off the lights. But don't worry, we will come back to Bright Room again in a few moments, but we're just going to see how this would look if you were using, say, a device that you've either purposely disabled Dolby Vision or doesn't support Dolby Vision, and you're watching this in HDR, where it would then default to HDR10. And if you wanted to watch it as it should be, as it was created, that would be in a dark room in the accurate picture mode of your TV. So if you have a different TV, if it's a Sony, just use custom picture mode. If you have any TV with Filmmaker, use the Filmmaker, or look to any of my other videos for other TVs on setting guides. Alright, so now we've turned out the lights. We're in HDR10 in the accurate mode. Again, perfectly visible. It's dark. Yes, it's meant to be. This is how it's supposed to look, but it's not that you can't see anything. Do note that the darkest of areas, the camera is just not going to be able to pick that up unless I way overexpose it and make everything look bad. So like here going into this cave, you can see that in person. It's just the camera is not going to pick up the darkest parts of that wall unless I turn up this exposure a lot. Ignore the flickering on the Sony. That's just a issue with the shutter of the camera that I couldn't get to fully get rid of. And yes, this does showcase where the LG leans a little bit more towards crushing near black and the Sony leans towards a little bit of over brightening near black. So there is more shadow detail on the Sony, but it is actually a little bit brighter than it's supposed to be. Both of which would be much closer if they were calibrated at this point, but I didn't want to do a calibrated comparison between them because most people aren't going to have that, and I want to show that even without the TVs calibrated, how this is going to look and how you can get it to look good for your room without deviating too far from creator's intent. So now I'm set the camera back to the room, so this is more how it looks in person. Again, it's pretty dark. My room could be darker. When I watched it, the room was completely dark. Alright, so now what we're going to do on my Apple TV, if I turn off the match dynamic range, and if you have, say, a Fire Stick or something, you can do the same. Most devices, you can disable the HDR Dolby Vision very easily and just leave it in SDR. So this is going to probably be the best way for a lot of people to watch at least this episode. So they're both roughly around the 150 nit range. They both have very similar gamma settings, with the Sony around 2.35 and the LG and BT 1886. So like this, you can already tell that there's much more detail that's visible, and the room is dark, everything's off. Now when I turn on the lights, again, it's pretty much impossible to see anything. But if you've been following me for a while, you probably know that I've said before on many occasions that if you're watching in a bright room, you should be watching in SDR, and that's not trying to be mean or say that HDR is bad or anything, but SDR is best for a bright room. And this is going to clearly demonstrate that. So starting on the Sony, I just switched it over to custom mode to have a different setting. Turn up the brightness. Contrast enhancer in SDR really didn't do much at all. Again, don't use that setting. Turning up the gamma is the biggest thing here. Turning on peak luminance to high gives you a nice overall bump in your overall brightness. On the LG, I'm going to switch over to the Expert Bright picture mode. And pretty much just turn up the brightness slider. Peak brightness on the LG does negatively impact the colors, but if you're just trying to see the image in a very bright room, then so be it. You're not going to really see that much color loss. Here's the number one thing about seeing it in a bright room in SDR is just changing the gamma. So 1886 and 2.4, almost the same. Going to 2.2, you get a nice bump. Going to 1.9, and then there you go. Like you see everything. You still see reflections and light. You're not going to beat that. No TV will. On the Sony, bumping the gamma up all the way is pretty much going to be about the same 1.9 as on the LG. So it really doesn't matter what TV you have. If you're going to watch a very, very dark show or movie in a very, very bright room, the best thing you can do is set it to SDR and then just change the gamma setting and turn up your backlight, or if it's an OLED, the OLED light. Dynamic contrast or contrast enhancer, again, you really shouldn't be using those settings because it doesn't really help anything. It's just going to create a perceived increase of artificial contrast, usually by crushing shadows or bringing down the high end closer to the mid-range. And if you have a more budget TV, chances are, if you're like in a standard picture mode or something, that contrast enhancer is going to be on by default. and that can actually be hurting your ability to see shadow detail or what is going on in this episode. All right, so now back on the Sony, just showing that the ambient light sensor, turning it on is actually making the image darker because I do have the settings maxed out on both TVs. And again, the contrast enhancer on the Sony in SDR, not doing really anything except changing some of the sky in the background. So there's no point to putting it on even if you were trying to squeeze any more brightness out. On the LG, the low setting was actually what made it the brightest here. So while this is as bright as the scene is going to get on these TVs, and again, still bright room, you can clearly see that the mood, tone, and just feeling of this whole episode is drastically different by doing this. So before we end, if you are going to be watching this in a bright room, what I'm going to do now is just go over like the best way to get it as close to what they intended you to see while also still being able to see it in a room with plenty of light. So what we're going to do is we're going to change the gamma to the 2.2 setting on the LG. We're going to turn off that contrast enhancer. Going to turn off any of the light sensing stuff. And on the Sony, the gamma of 2.2 would be custom mode with gamma at 0. Again, light sensors off, no contrast enhancer, nothing else, just very basic stuff. Have the brightness turned up and the peak brightness or peak luminance on high, because again, this is still very bright room. You can still see what's going on now. You see plenty more detail than you would see otherwise. And here, all I did was I turned off the light in the other side of the room that hits the TV and then also closed the curtain. That's it. I still left other lights on in the room, so there's still plenty of light in the room, and yet you can still see everything perfectly fine. You can see all that detail on the wall in that cave. So again, we're not going too far away from the creator's intent, but we are making it much more visible for viewing in a brighter room. And again, just set it to SDR, adjust your gamma and your brightness, and that's it. That should be all you have to do, and just try not to have lights hitting the screen. So I hope this helps you out. I hope you like it. Let me know below, and I'll catch you in the next one.